Hey guys, time for another Q&A session. The questions and the timestamps will be in the video description, as well as links to Patreon or Subscribestar if you want to ask your own questions or support the channel. Please check out the description. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Richard asked, has anyone written an updated book on the changing historiography of World War II? I'm interested in how theories waxed and waned. I'd like to see an overview of how our understanding of World War II developed over the last 75 years and how different approaches were taken up, modified or abandoned. For example, I was brought up to believe the war was a very close run thing, and by early 1941 it looked like Germany would inevitably triumph. Now opinion seems to have shifted towards claiming the opposite, that Germany could not have possibly won World War II, could not have defeated the Soviet Union, etc. Will these revised theories endure, or will they in turn be challenged and displaced? So the first thing I'm going to do is recommend the book, and I'm going to recommend this to everybody. It doesn't matter what country you're from, I'm going to recommend it to everybody because it should be of interest to everybody. Even though this book is particularly written for an American audience, I found it useful, and I'm British, so I found it useful. So here's the book I'm going to recommend, and everybody should read this book, okay? It is The Myth of the Eastern Front, the Nazi-Soviet War in American Popular Culture, written by Smesler and Davies. I don't know if I've said them names right, but I'll just zoom in a little bit. This is a book that I think everybody should get. And the reason is because this goes into quite a lot of depth. Now, it is on the American popular culture part, but it actually goes into the history of what happened just immediately after the war, which changed the perceptions of the way the historiography progressed immediately after the war, and we're still paying the cost of that change in perceptions. I can't sum the whole book up, but basically what these guys start saying is that immediately after the war, you had the Nuremberg trials and the trials going on in the centre of Europe for the Nazis or the National Socialists. And what was happening was that the Americans especially, and the British and the Soviets, were all very much of the opinion that these guys needed to be punished. Executions, the famous Nuremberg trials, we've seen all that. But what happened was, and it happened very, very quickly, even before the trials are over, even the famous ones, you start to get this shift in perception. And it's brought on mainly by the Cold War. Because I don't know what year the Cold War exactly started, whether you can put it to an exact date, but it's certainly by the end of the Second World War, even before the war's over, the Cold War is beginning to heat up. And you see this, he mentions a period in 1946 where the Americans are kind of becoming more lenient towards the Germans, even the Nazis themselves, the National Socialists. Why? Because the Americans are in Germany, they are looking after these people now, and they kind of have a vested interest to get them on their side. And also there's this great enemy in the East, which is the Soviet Union, and we have to fight against them. So it's like, well, maybe these Germans need protecting from that. And also it's like, oh, maybe we can get them on our side, maybe they can help us out, maybe we can have another army, that sort of thing. So very, very quickly opinion changes on the way that the Germans are and the way that the National Socialists are. And so while the executions do continue, a lot of the guys who really should have been executed for crimes against humanity and all the other stuff, they kind of actually let go. And, National Socialists to this day still go, oh, it was a show trial, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, there were show trials. He mentions the Soviet show trials. But a lot of guys got off. A lot of guys got off the hook, including many of the famous generals we know about, like Halder, Manstein, who committed war crimes and he actually got imprisoned for it. Guderian, obviously some of the ones like Keitel, they got executed, but a lot actually got away with it. And then went on to write memoirs, which is also written in the books. And what happened was this perception changed from the Germans being the great enemy and the Japanese being the great enemy to the Soviets and the Russians being the great enemy. So as a result, their perceptions change, and then they become open-minded to the Germans, which allows the influence of the Germans in. Now, these guys talk about what Halder does. This is why I'm recommending it. These guys talk about what Halder does to the historiography, and it's really important. This is why I'm saying read it, because it's important. Halder gets put in charge of the US Historical Division, and he's pretty much given the chance to rewrite history. You know, I hate to use the term because I rewrite history. I'm rewriting it now to anybody who this might be news to somebody. Like, oh, really? So technically this is rewriting history, but he rewrites it in the bad way. He distorts the history because his agenda is to paint the German Wehrmacht, especially the army and not the SS, as somehow separate. They're not committing crimes. It's all the SS's fault. It's all that madman Hitler's fault. All of the problems that happened in the war for the Germans can all be blamed to that Bavarian corporal and the SS and the evil National Socialists, and these glorious German generals were just undermined from the start, and it's all Hitler's fault. And it's not true. They point out it's just not true. He's made it up. And what's worse, so the American command knows that he's kind of doing this, but they don't really stop him from doing it. And it's like, oh, what are you doing? And they encourage him to go, hey, here's some documents. You know, have all the documents you want to try and write a history of World War II. So he's there with all these documents, and any incriminating evidence, we're just going to take that. Oh, I've lost it. Where's it gone? You know, it's like, are you kidding me? You gave the German generals like Halder all the evidence that you had, which they just tore to shreds, and we no longer have that evidence because they got rid of it. And yeah, you did that. Wow, how much information, how many questions about World War II, and how many things that we don't know about now have been ruined because Halder was given those documents. And it's not just Halder, he's like the main guy in charge, but it was a lot of them. It's unbelievable, really. A lot of the questions we have about World War II could have been answered if this hadn't have happened. And unfortunately, a lot of the myths now start coming into it. Halder paints the picture of the Germans as, oh yeah, military geniuses, heroic people, blah blah blah. It's not true. He says that he didn't want to go east. Oh, okay. This book provides all the evidence you need to know that yes, he did want to go east. He talks about the preemptive strike idea, and because this is a thing I've mentioned before in a previous video, I will link to it. If you're watching this on TV, you won't see the link pop up. And they point out, well, actually, in Halder's diary, he mentions the preemptive, like he says, no, the Russians have no chance of attacking us. And this was like in 1940. It's like, no, they're not going to attack us, but we're going to attack them. So if that doesn't undermine the entire thesis, then there you go. So there's a lot of that going on. But then this shift in attitude then allows the opportunity for the German generals to then write their own memoirs. You see that, Guderian, Manstein especially, von Mellenthin, how do you say his name, and all the other ones as well. And then this influences public opinion further, and it's like, oh, well, those Germans weren't so bad. Those German generals are on our side, part of the Cold War, yay. And it's like, oh, there's definitely a distinction between the German generals and the National Socialists, and clearly they're not the same, and there's no overlap at all. And these myths carry on to this day. And then they also talk about some of the authors that are still to this day publishing books that are whitewashing the Wehrmacht, whitewashing the Germans as a whole, except for the SS, obviously, and in fact, they're actually not doing that. And he talks about one in particular, which I have come across a couple of times now and have gone, that's a problem. I'll talk about a couple of them. One is that they talk about is Frank Kurowski, who I've got a book on the North African campaign, and he's talking about that, and his book is a little bit sort of, you can't really you can trust it to some extent, but not properly. And the other one is the one I've got on the Curlin pocket, Bridgehead Kurland, The Six Battles of Heeresgruppe Kurland. Now, Frank Kurowski is a German guy. He's dead now. He died in 2011. But I don't recommend this book at all. Don't buy this book. Just don't. It's terrible. I'm kind of dipping in and out of it because I have no choice, because very little's been written on Kurland, so I'm having to use whatever sources I can possibly get. But I wouldn't recommend it at all. When there's, and you see this with another guy as well, actually, and I've had to use this guy, Werner Hapt. You can't actually see his name. Let's see if he's on the side. Hapt, Captain, whatever you call it. This is one that's Army Group North, but he's written a few other ones. And basically, you see it in both of these books. Whenever there's the German army doesn't commit any crimes, doesn't do anything bad. There's no mention of atrocities. It's all like, we're holding on for our dear lives. These amazing Germans who are heroically standing against the red tide of the outnumbers a bazillion to one. And then when the Red Army commits a crime, it's like, look, there's crimes being committed by the communists. It's not us, but the communists. It's like, it's so biased, it's unreal. And these guys are vastly guilty of it. In this book, they don't mention Hapt, but they do mention Frank Kurowski. They call him a guru or a enthusiast. It's like, hey, look, the Germans are fighting on. If you can think of the typical Nazi propaganda, what these guys are doing are promoting Nazi propaganda in the post-war era, and still to this day, we're getting that post-war Nazi propaganda shoved down our throats from these books. And as a result of this, you've got a lot of people, a lot of enthusiasts who are, reading these books. They're like, well, the German generals were there. They will know better than anybody else, so I'm going to believe them. But unfortunately, that's the wrong attitude to have. These guys have got a vested interest in denying the crimes and promoting this myth of the Eastern Front as the Germans being these amazing, they're fighting for the right cause and so on and so forth, when in reality they're not. They were the ones waging the war of aggression, and the German army wasn't the professional machine of awesomeness that these guys painted out to be. So these guys in this book paint them as the gurus, these authors, and they call the World War II enthusiasts out and say that these guys aren't looking at the bigger picture. They're being influenced too much by the wrong people. So this book, it's not perfect. The reviews online that I've seen, Glance and House, are very much, get this book. A lot of people are against it. Those people who are against it, they've got some valid criticisms, like it doesn't go into everything, which, to be fair, it's a pretty decent book anyway. And it's the only one that I've seen. There might be a couple of others, but it's the only one I've seen that actually kind of addresses the issue. So it's a fair, good first shot, let's put it that way. The criticism with these guys is that they've gone too far, but I don't agree with that. And the criticism is that they've gone too far, but they're also not providing an all-round perspective. Really? I don't agree. I think this is a good book, and the people who are disagreeing with it have got a vested interest to try and defend Frank Kurowski and so on and so forth, because they believe in the myth. They want to believe this Panzer elite force of amazing Wehrmachtness, and so they have a vested interest. And there's also people who are Nazi and National Socialist, or whatever, or they're just Germans and they're just nationalists, which is a different thing, by the way. So these guys have got a vested interest in order to defend the old ideas that are now out of date. And plus, a lot of people they're just not educated on it. They don't understand. They don't realise, actually, there's been a lot of manipulation here as a result of the Cold War. There's also anti-communists, and anti-socialists in general. They are, and there's this, the whole myth of, the Germans were fighting against socialism. It's like, but they were socialists. They were fighting against Bolshevism. They weren't fighting against socialism. That doesn't make any sense. Because let's get into it then. Socialism is the socialised man, the producers, in common control, according to Engels in Das Kapital Volume 3. And of course, we all know that Hitler was like, no, it's socialised man, the race in common control. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. It's not capitalism. If you think it's capitalism, read The Vampire Economy, which you can get online for free as a free PDF. The Vampire Economy, written by Gunther Reinmann, who wrote, it's a primary source document written in 1939, I think, and it's basically paints the picture. He's a socialist, and he's a Marxist socialist, and he goes, this is Marxism. You know, he thinks it's Marxism at one point, or at least he says that the German industrialists think it's Marxism, and so they're reading Das Kapital in order to try and understand the German economy. But yeah, you still got people going on the side of the Nazis because they think, oh, this is anti-communism and it's all about capitalism. It's like it's ignorance. They just don't understand it. So there are a lot of myths and whatever else going on here, and to this day, people still believe in the myths, and it's really frustrating. And in terms of, was the war a close run thing, I assume you're talking about the war in the Soviet Union. It's hard to see beyond that. So yeah, I think that they could have won it, but it would have taken a few different things to have made that happen, and I'll get onto that in a minute. But you said, will these revised theories endure? No, some of them will do. Some of them will be correct. This is the point of revisionist history and the idea of looking at the past from different perspectives and reinterpreting it. The reason you do that is to try and... Because if I say, you know, Hitler is blonde, and then somebody comes along and goes, no, he's not blonde, here's the evidence why. It's like, oh, okay, we've all learned that Hitler is not blonde. Same thing applies to that. It's like, okay, they what, like, because originally the turning point was Kursk. No, the turning point is not Kursk. That's way too late. Kursk is just a blip on the map. It's nothing to do. You know, the turning point of World War II, Kursk is nowhere near. It's way too late. Stalingrad was then the turning point. I think Stalingrad was not Stalingrad, but the Fall-Blau campaign was the last chance for Germany to win. And once that failed, there's no more chance. But you could arguably say, and I would probably agree, that the turning point happened before Stalingrad and before the Caucasus and before Fall-Blau, arguably. And that turning point was then seen as Moscow in 1941, but now historians are now looking at the Barbarossa campaign itself, especially Smolensk, and this has all happened because the Soviet archives were kind of opened, although not really. You kind of have to beg Putin to be allowed in them now, because they were open for a bit and they were closed for a bit. They might still be open again, I don't know, but they're open and shutting all the time depending on what the Russians want. But yeah, so it's been revised to that, and I'll answer the next question in a second, which is similar, but basically, yeah, these you know, let's say you think it's Smolensk at the minute, let's say you're David Glantz or your whoever thinks it's Starhill, he thinks it's Smolensk. It's like, yeah, in 20 years' time, this will be challenged and a new theory will come along, and that's good. Now, maybe we'll come to the conclusion that Smolensk was a turning point in Barbarossa, which is where I'm saying, well, some of these revised things will endure, but then maybe the turning point happened earlier than that, or whatever. So, and that's good. We want that. We want the revision in there because we don't want the sort of Germany was amazing, we all love Frank Kurowski. Like, we don't want that because it's wrong, right? We're getting the wrong perspective, and we want truth, not bias, not trying to whitewash and, you know, salute Halder. We don't want that. So I think some theories will endure, but we've got to always be changing and ready to accept the changes when they come out, because it's all about the evidence. If the evidence changes, if there's new evidence, then we need to adapt. We need to adapt to that. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I think it does. Alex has asked, using the full power of 2020 hindsight, what strategy would you have pursued as the Axis in order to win the war? This is actually kind of a tough question, but I'm going to go with it. So the reasons I think at the minute that the Germans lost the war, there's multiple reasons, but this is the turning points kind of thing. So I think the oil campaign is probably the most decisive. And so they needed to win by October-ish of 1941, which then says, well, Barbarossa needs to be won by 1941. Now, up until Barbarossa, they seem to be doing everything militarily as good as they possibly could have done. So you can't really fault them on the military aspect too much up until the beginning of Barbarossa. So, okay. So then that suggests that all you need to do is get the Barbarossa campaign to be won better. Fought better. Now, there's a couple of ways of doing this. You could say, well, we could get the British to surrender or peace out, but we've seen that a few times. Hitler sent peace feelers out prior to the fall of France, and even after the fall of France. So we've seen that, and that didn't work. So there's an issue there. So then we come back earlier. So they could either really go with the peace and be like, we'll give up all our territory, but it's not really going to happen. Or we're going to keep on fighting. So that, there's no real way to get around that. So I would say it must have happened earlier, whatever it was, to change the outcome of the war. So I'm going to say that they would have needed to guarantee that Britain and France wouldn't have got involved in the war in 1939 as one possibility. So they would have had to, like they had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where the two socialist states got together. So then you could say, well, that maybe they could have done the same with the West. There's no reason why Hitler would not trust. Like, if he's willing to do a deal with Stalin, who is his great ideological enemy because he's a Marxist socialist, there's no reason why he wouldn't do it with the capitalist West, even though they are what Hitler calls international Jewish finance. That's what he refers to capitalism as, because he doesn't. Capitalism in his mind is made by the Jews. So there's no reason why, if he can deal with the devil on one hand, why can't he do two deals with the devil? Invade Poland, make sure the West is secure, be like, look guys, we really want peace, let the oil flow in, and then we'll go east. And if you look at what Oswald Mosley was saying, he was like, I didn't want to go to war because Hitler wasn't going to war with the West, he was going east. Hitler was going east. That's what he says this in Mein Kampf. He says it in his second book, which wasn't published, to be fair, but he says it in Mein Kampf at least. He's going east. He's not interested in the West to that extent. He has to go west because the West declares war on Germany. And Oswald Mosley's like, well, I don't want to go to war for Poland. I don't see the point, right? Why should I put British people on the line for Poland, right? Which I don't agree with. I'm just saying that's what Oswald Mosley said. So you can see the argument there. It's like, actually, if the West had the option to not get involved, kind of like the First World War, Britain had the option of not getting involved because of Belgium, but they chose to get involved because of Belgium. So it's like, well, there was pros and cons there, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, well, they didn't have to intervene in Poland, and then we could have just the British could have let the Germans and the Soviets go at each other. But they chose to get involved, and that's when, I'm kind of dumbing it down a little bit, but so it's like, if Hitler could have done a Chamberlain-Molotov pact in the West, that could have changed things entirely. Or Goering, who was in charge of stockpiling oil prior to the war, could have stockpiled much more oil prior to the war. He only stockpiled half as much as he wanted to stockpile, or as much as the army needed. Only half of it. So it's like, well, he could have stockpiled more, but then you've got a problem of, well, the Nazi economy is not prepared for that. Because the problem with the Nazi economy is that it's gone autarkic because Hitler doesn't believe in international Jewish finance. So you've got this problem where they need to trade for more oil, but they can't do it because they don't believe in exports and imports and blah blah blah. They reject the idea. And this is back to basic economics. If I'm selling bread and you got money, right? We swap, right? You buy the bread and I buy your money, and I sell you the bread and you take the bread. So we're swapping, right? You can't do that on it internationally because it's like, okay, I've got bread, or let's say I've got a barrel of oil, and let's say I'm America, I've got a barrel of oil and you're German, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to give you this barrel of oil. Can you give me money in return? And you're like, well, I've only got Deutschmarks or Reichsmarks. It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to trade you this oil because I can't spend Deutschmarks or Reichsmarks in the USA. So I need something back in return. I need dollars. And Germany doesn't have any dollars because Germany's no longer trading. It's no longer exporting and importing. And so it has no... So the trade breaks down. Adam Tooze talks about this in Wages of Destruction. By 1933, 34, 35... the Nazi economy is out of world trade. It ends world trade. It becomes autarkic. So that impedes the ability to import resources, and that's when they start buying trucks and then taking the wheels off the trucks and selling the trucks for scrap because they need the rubber tyres and they don't have enough rubber tyres. So it's like they're cannibalising their own... It's ridiculous. But that's because Hitler doesn't believe in capitalism. He believes in socialism. Can't wait for the comments in this. I'm just going to warm my hands on the battles going on in the comment section. But yeah, so really I would say in order for Germany to win the war strategically, it needs to probably stockpile more oil or get the British and the French to not declare war in 1939 or 40 and allow them to go east, or fix the Barbarossa plan. But how you fix that, I don't really know. It's hard to say. So that's basically your three options there. But I think actually, given the circumstances, they did pretty much everything right up until the opening of Barbarossa. If they could have just got more oil or they could have prevented or maybe got Britain's peace out in 1940 after the fall of France, that could have changed the course of the war. But I reckon they couldn't really. That was their only options, really, in my opinion, anyway. So Ken asks, given your thesis about the importance of oil and the role of the British blockade in stopping German oil imports, doesn't that lead toward the conclusion that the British decision to stay in the war was the actual turning point of World War II, which means the critical events were the German failure to destroy the British army at Dunkirk and Winston Churchill's subsequent decision to stay in? Again, this depends on how you look at it. Technically, yes, but not really, because Barbarossa was such a failure, that could have been the turning point of the war. You could also say, as I said before, the British could have peaced out, so that's what you're saying, but they didn't have to get involved in the war in the first place. In fact, there's another question, I'm not going to get into it today, but a few people have asked about the French campaign in 1940, and I've been sort of looking at it a little bit, and there's this perception, I don't know if it's true or not, I need to double check it, but that the French think that the British have dragged them into the war. So it's like, well, actually, if the British didn't declare war in 1939, or they had been persuaded not to declare war, would the French have followed in, blah, blah, blah. So in actuality, there's a few different options here. So it's not necessarily, it's not Britain saved the war. It's like, that's not necessarily the case. It's just Britain. That's why Britain was decisive. The blockade, and you could say the Battle of the Atlantic and obviously Battle of Britain, these events prevented resources from coming into Europe from the Americas and elsewhere around the world, which blockaded the Axis, which gave the ticking time bomb of we need to win before the oil runs out, which it does in October-ish of 1941. So this is why Britain is important, because they keep fighting. There's so many times where they could have just stopped fighting, but that's why they're important. It is. So, yes and no. I don't. Britain doesn't save the war, but it does. It puts that ticking time bomb on the Germans to win the war by the end of 1941, or at least knock out the Soviets sufficiently so that they can win in 1942. Also, it's not my thesis. I think it's a good thesis. And that's why I spoke about it. It was actually Toprani's thesis. I just looked at it and was like, that's brilliant. I'm going to make everybody aware of it. So it's actually I forget his first name. Toprani was the one who came up with it. But it wasn't just him. There was other people as well. But his was the main one that I used. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Luke then asks, I have a sort of general blanket question about troop quality for the Germans come 1943-44. In my mind, they are both battle-hardened veterans that dominate the battlefield and old men and kids scared beyond belief. I was hoping you could enlighten me to this. This is the problem of getting a brush and just painting everything, okay? You can't paint every German as a battle-hardened veteran, and you can't paint every German as an old man or a young kid. There are units that are veterans, there are units that are rubbish, there are units that are made up of kids, there are units that are made up of old men, there are units that are made up of young, fit, perfect age kind of men for the army. A good example of this, everyone's like, oh, the Waffen-SS were amazing. It's like, okay, don't look at the Totenkopf division in like the French campaign or even the Polish campaign. Was it in the Polish campaign? I can't remember. But don't look at the Totenkopf. It's like the French counterattack and the Totenkopf goes and runs off, right? So, again, it's like individual divisions, individual units, yes, you can sort of say, well, that was a veteran division, that was a poor division or whatever, but you can't really blanket it. Now, I would generally say 1941, 1942, the Germans have got a lot of veterans in their army because they've been fighting for a little while. Although, to how much they were battle-hardened, because in France they didn't do much fighting. The panzer divisions and the motorized divisions did, but the follow-up infantry divisions didn't do they did little fighting. Now in Barbarossa they did a lot of fighting, and in 1942 they do a lot of fighting as well. Now 43, you have an influx of new recruits because the German army is at its peak in 1943. At roughly the July period, it's got more. I think it's three. The Axis total, I think, is 3.8 million or something like that. There's a lot of. This is the most the German army ever gets in 1943, in size-wise. So you could say, well, there's a lot of influx of newbies in there, but there's obviously a lot of battle-hardened units in there as well. But the quality is starting to decline now because they've had to cut the training time because they're desperately needing manpower. And then by the time we get to 1944, the situation's really bad as well. But it gets massively worse after Bagration, Operation Bagration. So you could say after Bagration, the army's in desperate straits, and it's now, there are veterans in there, but it's now getting, you're getting your old men and young boys kind of thing. They're scraping the barrel by that point. But certainly up until 1943, you've got a lot of veterans and you've got a lot of newbies, but these guys are learning the ropes as well. They're in combat a lot, so it's like they're going to learn just by observing and being in the combat. So it's like, well, they're new, but they're also getting that experience as well. So it's hard to say, okay, they're all, just because they're new, they're not capable of fighting. But generally, as the war progressed beyond, I would say, really 6th Army gets destroyed, that's like a lot of veterans gone. They replace the units, but then they're all full of, new recruits, so then it's bad. But then 43, not really by 43, I say 44 onwards, that's when you start dying. That's when they start being old men and young boys. And it's really not until Bagration that you get that. So it's too general. You can't, like, in the Kurland campaign, there's units which are like veteran units, amazing, in terms of troop quality. Then you got the division next door, which is useless. You can't blanket it. That's kind of what I'm going to say here. You can't get the brush and paint it. That's what I'm going to say. But anyway, Yogikhan, I hope is his name. He says, my comment is from World War II, 1942, The Hitler's Soft Underbelly, 2011, by historian David Reynolds. He stated a quote, if I remember correctly, from Alan Brooke, head of the British Imperial Army. It stated that World War I and the high loss of officers was the cause of the poor performance and poor leadership of the early British Army in North Africa. Do you believe this is a true statement or just the normal course of an army learning and figuring out things and finding the right leaders, similarly to Fredonol in the US Army or countless Soviet military generals in the beginning of the Eastern Front? Okay, so the idea that the British didn't have any officers at the end of the First World War, where's that come from? So the army in the British Army in 1918 had no officers. They had officers, and a lot of them were new. A lot of them were young. So this I don't know where this comes from. Interestingly, Alan Brooke could actually be blamed for some of the disasters in World War II. So because in my opinion, let's look at North Africa. Richard O'Connor's there, and he has 2 divisions. Okay, I think he has 3, but one gets swapped out. So he has 2 divisions, and he wipes out the Italian 10th Army, which is 10 divisions or 15 divisions or something stupid. And he wipes it out. Probably the greatest victory, apart from maybe El Alamein, of the entire Second World War. Nobody's ever heard of it. Operation Compass. Which, again, if you're watching this on TV, you won't see the link pop up. So you have good generals in World War II. The problem is, of course, O'Connor gets captured along with John Combe, however you say his name. These guys get captured when Rommel attacks, and then you're kind of left with not really good generals, really. When you look at Operation Crusader, enough said. As Butler says, most of the generals are rubbish. The only one that's actually any good, well, there's Vivian Pope, but he gets killed in an air crash. And then there's Gatehouse, but he's just a brigadier. So there's not the reason the British are performing poorly is because if you watch my Operation Crusader in that part of the video where I talk about the officers, is because they are the wrong officers in the role. It's not because they're rubbish. It's just hey, I'm an infantry guy. Why am I leading tanks? Hey, I'm an artillery guy. Why am I leading tanks? It's the wrong thing. It's just the wrong. Auchinleck is an Indian Army officer. He has not. The Indian Army doesn't have tanks. Why is he put in charge of a tank army? It doesn't. A tank operation. It doesn't make any sense. So, and then Cunningham, who again is an infantry guy, he's just not the right guy for the job. And Gott gets promoted over and over again for failing over and over again, or not failing but not really doing much over and over again. So it's they put the wrong people in the wrong positions. Montgomery's got a lot of faults. I'm not going to defend him for everything, but he's got a lot of faults, but he is placed, and he has got at least the right kind of mentality for military stuff. He knows what he's doing in that sense. So you could say that it's actually a case of they had the generals, they just didn't use the right generals, or the generals got captured or killed and they were left with the dregs in a sense. And I would kind of go with that. So this idea that, high officer loss, but not only that, it's high officer loss in the British Army, high officer loss in the French Army, that's maybe why they got defeated. What about the Polish Army? What about the Russian Army or the Soviet Army? What about the German Army? The German Army fought World War I as well. The German Army got defeated in the First World War. So every army had the same problem. The Americans probably not so much. But as I said in the Purges video, the Americans start off with a tiny army, and after expanding to this massive force, technically the Germans do it as well, but the Americans even more so. And Eisenhower's a lieutenant who's in charge of the machine gun training facility or something like that, and he gets promoted up the ranks and becomes the theatre commander. It's what? So to say that, it's and what the Americans do, and I said this in the Purges video, the Americans get rid of all their old generals because they know they're useless. I think there's only one old style general who remains. The rest are gotten rid of. And the Soviets have their purges, which they probably did for political reasons with Stalin, although we're still not sure why. But yeah, that actually benefits them. The problem with the Soviets isn't that they didn't have enough good officers or whatever. It's because they got annihilated in the first war and their first battle, Barbarossa, and then they have to somehow rebuild their army whilst also fighting the Germans, whilst their economy, they're outnumbered now. It's just a disaster for them. It's nothing to do really with the officers. Oh, they got poor officers. No, they haven't. There's a lot of them who are decent as well. And it's the same with the British. It's like, oh, all the officers are poor. Not all of them, but they had the wrong guys in the wrong places, in my opinion. I can't talk about the Far Eastern Front because I haven't studied it properly, but that's the reason why I say it. So I don't think this Alan Brooke thing is correct. It's too simple, and it doesn't make sense when you look into the details of it, especially the fact that, they lost that many officers in the First War. 20 years have passed. 20 years have passed. No, and every army would suffer the same fate. It's not the case. It's absolutely not the case. Ben has asked, do you play any World War II strategy games, board or video? Any you particularly think do a good job of capturing the strategic decision making of the real thing? The only series that I could probably recommend is Hearts of Iron. But, Hearts of Iron 4, I think needs a better order of battle system. You need not entirely, but you need a system like they had in Hearts of Iron 3, but you also need logistics. They don't do a very good job of logistics, your troops go slower. It's like, that's not what logistics is about. Plus, I don't think the attrition rate in Hearts of Iron is right. You need to lose more men. In the attacks, the Germans lost a load of men, especially in Barbarossa. They lose, in fact, the Manstein sickle cuts towards the French coast. I'm doing this backwards, so it's that way for you guys. The Manstein sickle cut, they lose like half their tanks, right? They lose some they lose 600, or they had 600 and they lose half of them. I forget. They lost a lot of their tanks, and this isn't represented in Hearts of Iron 3, 4, whatever. It's just not represented. So I think Hearts of Iron it's probably the only one that comes to mind which is actually, it gets it mostly right, I guess. But I wouldn't say that it's got too many. There's too much wrong with it. I don't want to say they should have reintroduced the Hearts of Iron 3 order of battle, because that was just too clicky, and maybe have the option of doing that, because I think it's too simple now. You just put everybody in one army and just go east. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you need to have corps and divisional level, and I think you also should have battalions. Battalions should be able to get your Sturmgeschütz battalion out of one division and throw it at another. That's what the Germans did. You should be able to do that, and you can't do it. So that's, to me, that's what it should be doing. So Hearts of Iron 4 was, in my opinion, it got it right, I think, in a lot of ways. I like the industry way it did it. I like the a lot of the stuff. I like the fact there's more provinces. I like a lot of it, but I don't like the order of battle. And I don't like the fact that you don't have battalions, and I don't like the fact that the logistics is wrong. If they fix those three things, 100% Hearts of Iron. Every other game that I can think of doesn't really come close. I'm trying to think. I've heard of Gary Gibbsby's War in the East. I actually bought it for myself as a Christmas present in 2016, and I haven't ever installed it or played it. So I need to do that, but that's not strategy anyway. That's more Barbarossa. And I've heard that's pretty good. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But yeah, in terms of strategic decision making, I can't think of any others that come close to Hearts of Iron. So Hearts of Iron all the way. Besotten Jenny asked, if you were a young man in the UK in 1939 and had to sign up for the frontline service until the end of the war, what would you sign up for and why? Well, I wouldn't do Navy, and I wouldn't do Air Force, the RAF. I wouldn't do them because I'm not a Navy or Air Force guy, so I wouldn't really go for that. So if I had to do frontline service as well, I was like, oh, logistics. But no, the frontline service, I don't really... So the problem with the British, because you're saying the UK didn't exist in 1939. Great Britain in 1939 They didn't have very good tanks. Saying that Matilda would be good. No, they didn't. I don't think they have very good tanks, and I'm not really a tank guy. So I'm going to say no to that, which means I'm kind of left with infantry. So I'm going to go with infantry, and I'm going to go with single shot rifles are not very good. So I'm going to go with a Bren gun. So I'm going to sit there in North Africa with a Bren gun. That's me. I think that'll be good. Just sit there. I can do suppressing fire. That's fine. I can manage that. Yeah, Bren gun team sorted. And also, I wouldn't be an officer because I'm not part of the upper class. So if you believe in class, so I'm not part of that. So I wouldn't be an officer, unfortunately. So yeah, I think Bren gunner. Why? Because I've ruled everything else out. I can't think of anything else. Why would I? I don't know. I just think it'd be interesting. It wouldn't be very good. I probably wouldn't survive. But it would be interesting for 5 minutes while I fire my machine gun at a tank. Ugh. Anyway. So we start with a Richard Stokes question. Let's end with a Richard Stokes question. Who sacked more generals in World War II? Hitler or Churchill? You want me to count? Right, I'm going to just... No, hold on a second. I'm not going to count, but I am going to say Hitler. Why? Because Churchill had like 3 divisions in like North Africa. Hitler had 3 army groups. It's going to be Hitler. There's no way it's going to be Churchill. Churchill did sack quite a few, and I don't know about the not Middle East, I don't know about the Far East, to be fair. So he might have sacked a lot more there. But no, Hitler all the way. Hitler all the way. Oh, what fun it is. It's March. Well, I was singing Christmas songs. So, yeah, no, Hitler all the way. Who sacked more generals in World War II, Hitler or Stalin? Oh, no. I have no idea. I don't even know where to begin with that. I wish there was a list, actually. Maybe there is a list. If anyone knows of the list of who, sacked generals in World War II, that'd be great. But don't forget, though, Hitler, while he sacked a lot, he didn't shoot a lot. People are like, oh, he shot loads of his generals. No, he didn't. There's the guy at Ryan, however you say the bridge. That guy got shot. There's a few people got shot. Halder didn't get shot. Okay, fair enough, he ended up in a concentration camp. But Halder didn't get shot. Guderian didn't get shot. He got dismissed. There's loads of people got dismissed for not obeying the Führer's orders. And as you'll see in the Kurland campaign, there was even generals who just went, I'm not listening to this guy, I'm going to do my own thing. And they didn't get shot. So I just want to point that out. So, but who sacked more generals in World War II? Hitler. Hitler all the way.